Among the many writings of antiquity, few are as fascinating as the Book of Jubilees. Called the Little Genesis, it retells the stories of creation, the flood, and the patriarchs with surprising details, offering a perspective different from what we find in the scriptures. But what truly stands out are the unique details, revelations about angels, additional explanations of the laws of Moses, and even a sacred calendar different from the one we know. These passages influenced Jewish communities and even some early Christian groups. For some communities, this book was sacred and inspiring, but for most traditions, it carried risks, different teachings, unusual commandments, and interpretations that could confuse the faithful. Thus, over time, the Book of Jubilees was rejected, becoming part of what we call the apocryphal writings, yet its influence remained, echoing in the faith and imagination of generations. But after all, what revelations did this book contain within its pages that provoked such rejection? Today we are going to explore the Book of Jubilees and uncover the forbidden secrets of one of the most mysterious writings of antiquity. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can keep up with all our upcoming stories. The Book of Jubilees emerged during a period of intense religious transformation between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD, when the Jewish people faced cultural pressures from Hellenism and sought to reaffirm their identity. It was in this context that this text was written, presenting itself as a reinterpretation of the Torah, not merely repeating Genesis and Exodus, but reorganizing them in a new format, with additional details and stricter commandments. Called the Little Genesis, the book divides the history of the world into cycles of 49 years, called Jubilees. This structure was not only chronological, but also spiritual, suggesting that all creation followed a sacred calendar established by God. This calendar was different from the one adopted by other Jewish traditions, which already caused controversy in its time. In addition to chronology, the Book of Jubilees adds new narratives. It speaks of the activity of angels since creation, describes the flood in greater detail, provides further explanations about the covenant with Abraham, and expands the understanding of the laws given to Moses. For many, these revelations deepened faith. For others, they were exaggerated or risky. Although it was valued by communities such as Qumran, where fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the book was not accepted in the councils that defined the Jewish and Christian canon. Even so, it survived in the Ethiopian Bible, where it is still read today as part of the scriptures. Thus, the Book of Jubilees occupies a unique place in history. Rejected by many, but preserved by some, it remains as a testimony to the disputes over what should or should not be considered inspired. 1. The sacred calendar and the structure of the Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees does not simply retell biblical history. It reorganizes it within a sacred calendar. According to its structure, the entire history of the world follows cycles of 49 years, called Jubilees. Each cycle was made up of 7 periods of 7 years, reflecting the centrality of the number 7 in Jewish spirituality. The 7th day was the Sabbath, the 7th year was the sabbatical year, and the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, represented liberation, forgiveness, and renewal. This system showed that creation not only had order, but also a sacred rhythm. For the author of the book, nothing in Israel's history happened by chance. Creation, the flood, the calling of Abraham, and even the giving of the law at Sinai all fit into this divine calendar. It was a way of affirming that God governs time and that the people would only live in true communion with Him if they oriented themselves by this heavenly clock. But there was one crucial difference. While official Judaism used a lunar calendar of 354 days, the Book of Jubilees defended a solar calendar of 364 days. This had a huge impact, as it altered the dates of festivals, harvests, and sacrifices. Communities that followed Jubilees celebrated Passover, for example, on different days than those observed in Jerusalem. For groups like the Essenes, who lived in isolation in the desert and sought absolute purity, this alternative calendar was a mark of identity. They believed that the lunar system adopted at the temple was corrupted, and that only the solar calendar preserved the original order established by God at creation. Thus, following Jubilees was an act of fidelity to the divine will. On the other hand, for the religious leaders in Jerusalem, this divergence was seen as a threat to the unity of the people. If each group followed a different calendar, the risk was that the faith would fragment and the authority of the temple would be weakened. It is no wonder, then, that the Book of Jubilees was viewed with suspicion. Accepting its structure meant questioning the very heart of Jewish religious life. In the end, the calendar of Jubilees reveals much more than a mere issue of dates. It shows us an ancient struggle for spiritual authority and religious identity. For some, it was the true order revealed by God. For others, it was a danger that could divide Israel. This tension helps explain why the book, though revered in certain communities, was rejected by the official tradition. 2. Angels and mysteries in the Book of Jubilees. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Book of Jubilees is the way it expands the role of angels in the history of humanity. From the very beginning, the book states that it was angels who transmitted the revelation to Moses on Mount Sinai, reorganizing the narrative of creation and the history of the patriarchs so that he could write it down. In other words, the text presents itself as a heavenly account, coming directly from the spiritual realm. In Jubilees, angels appear divided into specific orders. There are the angels of the presence, who serve before God, the angels of sanctification, who continually offer praise, and others who fulfill tasks related to creation and the governance of the world. This detailed hierarchy goes far beyond what the Torah reveals, offering the reader a more structured view of the spiritual universe. Another striking point is the relationship between angels and humanity. The book describes how some of these beings rebelled, marrying the daughters of men and producing giants, a more detailed version of what appears in Genesis 6. These episodes explain the corruption of the world before the flood, showing that evil arose not only from human disobedience, but also from the fall of spiritual beings who violated divine order. Jubilees also links angels to the revelation of the law. It presents the commandments as part of an eternal order, preserved in heaven since creation, and transmitted to humanity through these divine messengers. Thus, following the law was not merely obeying a human code, but aligning oneself with the very rhythm of heaven. These mysterious details about angels and their participation in history were both fascinating and controversial. For some, they deepened the understanding of the spiritual world. For others, they opened the door to dangerous speculations and interpretations that could divert from the simplicity of faith. It is not hard to understand why the Book of Jubilees divided opinions. It offered a profound dive into spiritual mysteries, but was also considered too bold, arousing suspicion among believers. 3. The laws and commandments reinforced in the Book of Jubilees. If in Genesis and Exodus the law appears as a progressive covenant between God and his people, in the Book of Jubilees it gains a new dimension. It is presented as a set of eternal commandments, established since creation, and guarded by the angels in heaven. For the author, the commandments were not only rules for Israel, but universal principles valid for all generations. Jubilees especially emphasizes the importance of the Sabbath. It is not seen merely as a day of rest, but as a cosmic institution observed from the first angels to Adam and the patriarchs. Keeping the Sabbath is described as a sign of the eternal covenant, and violating it was considered one of the gravest sins. This emphasis reveals the author's attempt to protect the identity of the people amid external influences that threaten to weaken the practice of the law. Another central point is the issue of purity. The book sets forth strict commandments regarding food, marriage, and moral conduct. Many of these instructions go beyond what is in the Torah, showing a tendency to intensify the requirements of the law. This reflected the pursuit of an absolute holiness, separated from neighboring nations and in total faithfulness to God. In addition, Jubilees gives great attention to the covenants made with the patriarchs. Abraham, for example, is portrayed as someone who already observed the commandments and festivals even before the law was given at Sinai. This idea reinforced the notion that the Torah was not only revealed to Moses, but existed since creation as part of God's eternal order. This rigor, however, was one of the reasons why the book was eventually rejected. Many saw in its commandments a burden too heavy, one that could drive the faithful away rather than draw them closer. Still, for communities such as Qumran, Jubilees was an inspiration, for it offered a high standard of purity and obedience. Thus, the Book of Jubilees reveals a faith that sought to shield itself against external influences by reinforcing laws, rituals, and commandments, a reflection of a people striving not to lose their identity in a constantly changing world. 4. The stories of the patriarchs under a new light. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Book of Jubilees is the way it retells the stories of the patriarchs. Instead of merely repeating the accounts of Genesis and Exodus, the text expands them, adding new details that bring fresh color to the narrative. It is as if the author opened the lines between the scriptures, revealing secrets that had long remained hidden. In the case of Adam and Eve, for example, the book describes in greater depth their time in Eden and the commandments they received before the fall. These accounts are presented in a stricter tone, with emphasis on laws of purity and holiness that, according to the author, were already known since the earliest days of humanity. The life of Noah is also highlighted. Jubilees expands the story of the flood, explaining how the fallen angels and giants corrupted the earth, leading God to send the judgment of the waters. After the flood, the book details the covenant made with Noah, including specific laws about blood and food, presented as part of an eternal and universal order. When it comes to Abraham, the text portrays him as a model of obedience, someone who already kept the Sabbath and followed commandments even before the Torah was given. Jubilees reinforces his faithfulness in episodes like the sacrifice of Isaac, emphasizing his complete submission to the divine will. It is as if Abraham is presented not only as the father of faith, but also as the father of absolute obedience. The stories of Jacob, Joseph, and Moses are also enriched with details not found in the traditional Bible, always with the purpose of showing that the law was present from the very beginning. The message is clear. The history of the patriarchs is not just a distant past, but a reflection of God's eternal order, repeated in every generation. This retelling of the patriarchal stories gave the Jewish people a sense of continuity. Instead of depending only on the revelation at Sinai, Jubilees showed that the roots of faith were tied from the very beginning to obedience to the law. Yet this vision was also controversial, as it seemed to distort the traditional biblical narrative in order to impose greater rigor. Thus, the Book of Jubilees not only preserves the memory of the patriarchs, but transforms them into examples of an idealized holiness designed to inspire and at the same time challenge the faithful of its time. 5. The influence of the Book of Jubilees on ancient communities. Although it was later rejected by the official canon, the Book of Jubilees had great influence in various Jewish communities and even among some early Christians. Its strict view of the law, its emphasis on the Sabbath, and its alternative calendar became hallmarks of groups that sought to separate themselves from mainstream Judaism and live out a purer spirituality. One of the greatest testimonies to its importance was its presence among the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered at Qumran in the 20th century. There, fragments of Jubilees were among the most well-preserved texts, indicating that the Essenes, the community that inhabited those caves, regarded it as a sacred book. For them, Jubilees was a guide that confirmed their exclusive practices and their conviction that they were the true people of Israel, faithful to the original calendar and laws. Among early Christians, the book also left echoes. Some of the themes that appear in the New Testament, such as the importance of angels, the expectation of a final judgment, and even the idea that the law was inscribed from the beginning, resemble concepts developed in Jubilees. Although it was not included in the Christian canon, its circulation shows how the boundaries between official and apocryphal texts were more fluid in the early centuries. In Ethiopia, the book found a permanent home. Incorporated into the Ethiopian Bible, it continued to be read and passed down through generations, preserving a tradition that was lost in almost every other part of the world. This Ethiopian preservation is one of the reasons why the text has survived to our day. The influence of Jubilees proves that it was not merely a literary curiosity, but a spiritual manual for entire communities. It shaped practices, strengthened identities, and offered a worldview in which human history was inscribed in a detailed divine plan. Thus, the Book of Jubilees may have been banned from the canon, but it never ceased to echo. Its impact shows how ancient faith was diverse and how different communities found in it answers to their spiritual questions. 6. Why was the Book of Jubilees rejected from the canon? The great question surrounding the Book of Jubilees is why, despite its popularity in certain communities, it was excluded from the biblical canon. The answer lies in a combination of theological, practical, and political factors that shaped the faith over the centuries. One of the main reasons was its legalistic rigor. Jubilees presents the law as something absolute, valid since creation, and even adds commandments that do not appear in the official Torah. For religious leaders, this excess could confuse the faithful, imposing rules that God had never established. The book seemed more like an intensification of the law than an inspired complement. Another controversial point was the solar calendar of 364 days, different from the lunar calendar used in Jerusalem. If accepted, it would mean that feasts, sacrifices, and celebrations would fall on different days, dividing the people and undermining the authority of the temple. For priests and leaders, this was unacceptable. In addition, Jubilees gave great emphasis to angels and spiritual revelations, assigning them fundamental roles in history. While fascinating, this excess of detail was seen as dangerous speculation. Many believed the text could open the door to heresies or superstitious practices, distracting from the worship of the one true God. Finally, there was also a historical and political factor. The early church, like official Judaism, needed unity. Councils and leaders opted for a more restricted canon that could ensure consensus among communities spread throughout the Roman Empire. Jubilees, with its distinct ideas, did not fit into this project of uniformity. Thus, the book ended up being classified as apocryphal, preserved only in isolated traditions, such as that of Ethiopia. But its exclusion did not erase its importance. It reveals how the definition of the canon was designed to generate unity in the Church. 7. The legacy of the Book of Jubilees in the history of faith. Although it was rejected from the official canon, the Book of Jubilees left a profound mark on the history of Judeo-Christian spirituality. Its exclusion did not mean total oblivion, for it continued to influence traditions, inspire communities, and raise questions about the limits of revelation. In the early centuries, Jubilees was read alongside other sacred writings in both Jewish and Christian communities. Its way of presenting the patriarchs as observers of the law, even before Sinai, reinforced the idea that obedience was at the center of the relationship with God. This emphasis shaped the theology of strict groups such as the Essenes, and may have even echoed in debates between Pharisees and early Christians about the role of the law in salvation. Even outside the canon, its imagery and concepts continued to circulate. The emphasis on angels and the divine calendar appears in other apocryphal writings, and even in later mystical interpretations. For modern scholars, Jubilees helps fill gaps about how Judaism of the intertestamental period understood the spiritual world and the relationship between heaven and earth. In Ethiopia, as we have seen, the book was preserved and included in the local Bible. This made it a unique window into early Christianity. By studying it, researchers can glimpse how the faith might have developed differently if these texts had been universally accepted. Still, Jubilees continues to fascinate us because it opens a window into a broader, more diverse, and more mysterious Judaism and Christianity. It reminds us that the history of the Bible was not linear, but full of human choices that shaped what we now know as Scripture. In the end, studying the Book of Jubilees does not weaken faith, but makes us value even more the preserved Bible. For alongside the rejected texts, we see the divine wisdom in guiding the Church to choose books that would ensure unity among Christians. I hope this video has been helpful to you. If it was, please give it a like. It really helps us reach more people. If you have any thoughts or ideas to share, we'd love to read them in the comments. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching, and may God bless you.